And even when it was ranked in the 30s a couple of days prior to that, it could be ranked in the hundreds. And it would still be ranked higher than Samsung because you can't invest in Samsung. Well, technically, you actually can invest in Samsung, but that's a bit of a story. We'll save that for another video, maybe. So if you're on this video, that means that you hopefully watched a previous video on why I personally think Samsung would be a great long-term investment. And it definitely is possible to invest in the Samsung, but like I said in that previous video, it's a little bit of an interesting process and it's not as straightforward of a company to invest into, such as Apple, for example. The reason behind that is because Samsung is a company based out of South Korea. So because it is a foreign company, that means that American investors can invest into it through American stock exchanges such as the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. But there definitely are some ways that you can kind of get around that. For example, you can invest into it through the Korean exchange, or you can even invest into it as an over-the-counter stock through Pink Sheets through certain brokerage apps such as Fidelity. However, there are certain things about that you have to keep in mind. For example, if you want to invest into it through the Korean exchange, you have to open a South Korean-based brokerage account, which I would imagine is a lengthy process, especially if you're coming from another country. Or if you decide to invest into it through the over-the-counter market, that's something you can definitely do, but you gotta keep in mind that the over-the-counter market isn't as regulated as the New York Stock Exchange. So every purchase you make into Samsung through that process won't be regulated. That may have some security, maybe even financial safety issues. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. Now, there is another way to invest into Samsung, and I personally think that this way is the most convenient way to invest into it because it allows you to invest into it and view it through popular brokerage apps such as Robinhood, and that process is by investing into it through a Korean-based ETF. Now, for those of you guys that don't know what an ETF is, it stands for an exchange traded fund, and the best way you can think about an ETF is a basket full of stocks that you can invest into all at once through one, stock. And that basket full of stocks may share some similarities, such as they may be in the same sector, or they may be somehow within the same category of an index fund, such as the S&P 500. They're actually really cool investments that I'm in myself, and I recommend to a lot of people that are investing for the first time. But anyway, Samsung is part of two different South Korean-based ETFs, and I want to go into details into both of those because the differences between the two may determine which one you pick if you decide that you want to invest into Samsung. The first one's called the iShares MSCI South Korean Fund ETF. It roughly has a share price of about $78, almost $80 per share. Now, this ETF has about 101 holdings, which means there are 101 different shares within its basket of an ETF. And its top three sectors consist of technology, consumer cyclicals, and industrials. And as you can see, technology obviously takes the bulk of that ETF, being at over 40%. And within that sector and the entire portfolio, these are the top three holdings of this ETF, Samsung being number one at about 23%. Now, here's an honorable mention. Samsung SDI, which is a battery and electronic manufacturing avenue of Samsung, the company, is actually the fourth largest holding within that sector as well. So you're kind of double dipping, if you will, into two different categories of Samsung. Now, the other ETF is called the Franklin FTSE South Korean ETF. You're gonna know some similarities out of the gate, aside from its share price, which is about $28, almost $30 a share, so a lot less. So this ETF has a bit more companies within its holdings. It actually has 156 holdings or companies within its basket. And as you can see, its top three sectors are roughly the same. Technology being at number one at almost 40%. The only difference is that consumer cyclicals is third place while industrials is second, so they do a little flip. Now, their top three holdings in general are exactly the same, with Samsung being in first place. I believe it's a little under 20% of it holding. And an honorable mention, once again, Samsung SDI, that battery and electronic manufacturer department of Samsung, is the fourth largest holding. So you've got a double dipping effect again. So as you can see, both of these ETFs have some pretty similar characteristics. So it seems like you can't really go wrong, but there are some things that I want you guys to keep in mind when it comes to ETFs and these particular ETFs that you would want to invest into to get your hands on a Samsung. So the first thing you want to keep in mind is that ETFs are really beneficial for diversity. That's why I always recommend those to new investors, especially when they're not really sure about how to build their portfolio, or what good investment is better than the other one, and they're really concerned about losing a lot of money. They really want to avoid volatility. Obviously, when you have a lot of stocks that you're investing into, if one stock does bad for a day or a week, then it can easily be compensated by 2 or 3 other stocks that have a really good week. So the amount of volatility you're dealing with is a lot less. So with that being said, ticker symbol FOKR, or the Franklin version of this ETF, has a bigger holding at 156, almost 160, so almost 60 more than EWY. So that makes it a lot less volatile potentially. You also got to keep in mind what companies are in its umbrella and if they're in the same sector or subsectors, because over time you'll realize that a lot of companies may influence how a lot of other companies do. For example, Tesla and other EV companies. Also, another thing you want to keep in mind are the expense ratios. So with ETFs, since they're a basket full of stocks, you would imagine that somebody behind a computer created these ETFs, and not all ETFs are stagnant, meaning they come out with a list of companies under their umbrella, and those are the only companies that will always be under their umbrella till the end of time. A lot of them are very fluid, so over time, they may buy more into a particular company, they may sell more of a particular company, and the amount that they're holding is less or becomes more over a period of time. So that management of that ETF is what you're paying for, and that's called your expense ratio. So with that being said, EWY actually has an expense ratio of 0.59%, which doesn't sound like a lot. That basically means that for every $10,000 that you invest into this ETF, you'll be charged $59 a year. Now inversely, FLKR actually has an expense ratio of 0.09%, which means you'll be charged $9 every year for every $10,000 you invest into, which I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't see $9 go away from $10,000. Maybe not even $59 from $10,000, but that has a little bit of importance as well. And that comes in when you think about the dividend. That's actually one thing that I love about investing into ETFs is the majority of the ETFs that are available to be invested into pay some type of dividend. Now, the situation with these two ticker symbols is a little bit interesting because there's a lot of, I guess, confusing information. I've done research, for example, on EWY, where some websites say that it doesn't pay a dividend, but other websites say that its ex-dividend day is a certain period of time. So we're just gonna assume that neither one of these ETFs pay a dividend. But if they did pay a dividend, let's say they pay you $200 a year, you're not necessarily making $200 a year completely, because you have to pay the fees as well for the expense ratio. So for EWY, you're technically only getting $141 because $59 is a fee for the expense ratio. Same thing with FLKR, except your fee is $9, so you're technically making only $191 from dividends and not $200, not considering the capital gains. So those are things that you definitely want to keep in mind of, besides the fact that they'll give you ins on Samsung. I personally would honestly select EWY over FLKR for the simple reason that their holdings into Samsung are greater than FLKR's holdings. So every time I put money into EWY, more of that money is going into Samsung as opposed to if I put it into the other ETF. But that's just my personal opinion. And if you got to this point, you would ultimately know why you feel like Samsung is a great long-term hold. But if you don't, make sure you guys watch this video. We dive deep into that. And the answer, at least for me, was a lot more surprising than I would have even imagined, especially being a Samsung phone holder. So I appreciate you guys watching, and until next time, take care.